absolutely delighted to have Professor Anna Maria Mayda give a talk to us this evening. She is a professor of economics at Georgetown University, which is with a joint appointment in the School of Foreign Service. She is originally, however, from Rome. So she's Italian and did her laurea at La Sapienza in Rome, back in the old days of the traditional laurea, not the 3-year laurea these days. Back when people were tough. So she did that, and then she went to for some reason she went to Harvard University in Massachusetts, not for the weather, probably, where she got her MA and her PhD in economics. She has, in addition to a stellar academic record, including publications in the very best economics journals, the most selective ones. She's also had some policy experience working for the World Bank and in the IMF, the research department, as well as being a senior advisor to the chief economist of the Department of State. Was that Keith Maskus at the time?
First Rob Newman and then Keith.
Then Keith, yeah. Yeah, I saw him. I gave a talk there when he was during the Trump administration. He was less happy, I think. Anyway, Professor Mayda is here to talk to us about her research on immigration. She has for many years worked on sort of this intersection between trade and migration, as well as political economy. And she's going to talk today on the fiscal impact of immigration in the U.S., evidence at the local level, an empirical piece. And Anna Maria, again, welcome. Thank you. And normally we usually suggest a 40-minute presentation, after which we'll open it up to Q&A to people in presence as well as online. So over to you.
Thank you. Okay. Thank you very much for the invitation to present. I'm very glad to be here. Today, I'm going to present joint work with Mine Senses, who's at Johns Hopkins, Washington, D.C., and Walter Steingras, who's at the Bank of Canada. And actually, I'm going to stand up to be a little bit more lively. It's late in the evening, so everybody must be very tired. Let me give you some background about this work. Let me see. Okay, good. So, it's now. I stand by qualche volta, quindi I can also use the laptop. Okay, it just works. Okay, good. So, a lot of my work is, as Mike was saying, on trade and migration. This is a piece mostly on migration, but you will see there is also in the theoretical framework some trade theory. But I'm going to give, for the most part, the intuition about the theoretical framework. But for now, the background is that immigration, like other dimensions of globalization, has been in the public sphere a lot, in the news, and it has been a very contentious issue. Immigration has an impact through many different channels, and it's very important to understand these impacts to get the full picture about how it can affect also the politics and the policies in the destination country. So immigration can have an impact through the labor market channel, and this is the channel that has received the most attention from an academic point of view. The other channel is fiscal effects, which is the topic of this paper. Migration can also affect the destination country by having an impact on markets of goods and services. So, for example, there is very interesting work showing that the arrival of migrants decreases prices of goods and especially services. And this is work for Italy, for Spain, and for the United States. There is work at the intersection between migration and trade, migration and foreign direct investment. There is work on non-economic effects of migration. So, for example, through cultural effects, through security and crime effects, or political effects. But from an academic point of view, I would say that most of the work is on the labor market channel. So basically, there is a never-ending series of papers that asks the following question. Do immigrants negatively affect the wages of native workers? Do they decrease the employment rates of the native workers in the destination country where they go? And the results of this literature are not yet definitive. There is still a lot of debate about what the answer to this question is. But besides that, one of the main points of this work is to point out that the other channels are also very important. Maybe academic economists have overemphasized the labor market channel, especially from a policy point of view. Policymakers tend to worry maybe even more about fiscal effects and definitely about non-economic effects of migration. So what do we mean by fiscal effects? We mean the impact of migration on revenues, so how much people pay in taxes, expenditures, public expenditures, so how much governments spend on all those goods and services that are provided to citizens, like schools, public transportation, parks and recreation, and so on. And to give you a sense about how much policymakers care about these fiscal effects, let me tell you that there is this very important report by the National Academy of Science, and this report came out in 2016, and this report devotes 2 chapters to the labor market channel, 3 chapters to fiscal effects, and 1 chapter to all the other economic impacts. So definitely policymakers are thinking a lot about fiscal effects. Yet, if you look at the academic literature on fiscal effects, it's quite small. So let me jump right away into telling you what we do in this paper. We look at the impact of migration on both public revenues and public expenditures in the United States at the local level. So for us, the local level is anything starting from below the county level up to the county level. We aggregate up revenues and expenditures of cities, towns, school districts, and counties, all the way up to the county level. And we look at the impact of the overall number of migrants that we divide by the local population, so shares of migrants, but also we distinguish between the impact of low-skilled versus high-skilled migrants on revenues and expenditures. And as you read the academic economic literature, you will have seen that academic economists worry a lot about endogeneity issues. What are endogeneity issues? They are the fact that in the specific context of migration, migrants tend to sort themselves into specific locations. So the distribution of migrants within the United States is not random. And when you estimate the impact of migration, you have to take that into account, and you have to address that non-random allocation of migrants within the United States with econometric techniques, because our goal is to estimate a causal effect of migration on public revenues and public expenditures. So the way we interpret our estimates is as the causal effect of immigrants on these outcome variables. And the nice thing is that we can use very nice data, because we have data on total revenues, total expenditures, but also expenditures and revenues broken down by type. We have a lot of information, so we can analyze the mechanisms of impact.
Talking about migration, migrants, we're talking just about the stock or also the rates of change.
We have data on stocks, but we will do a within fixed effects estimation. So in practice, the variation that we exploit is the variation in the change in the stock of migrants. So it's a rough measure of the flow. Yeah. Okay, so now let me give you a preview of the results that we find. And keep in mind that these results have very important policy implications, because of course governments think a lot about what the net impact of migration is likely to be from a fiscal point of view. Well, what we find is that with our data that is between 1990 and 2010, the overall immigration that took place between 1990 and 2010 had, on average, a close to zero impact on provision of public goods and services. So what this means is that all the immigrants who arrived in those 20 years, on net, on average, did not affect in the United States the provision of public goods at the local level. So this is an important result. It's a very important policy relevant result. And the magnitude of the effect is that on average, the arrival of immigrants in these 20 years decreased provision of public goods by a mere 0.3% per year. So we can actually estimate precisely a very, very small impact. But this is on average. But we also find that there is a lot of heterogeneity in terms of the effects by skill level. So we find that actually if you break down the total number of migrants between low-skilled and high-skilled, the low-skilled are those with less than a college degree, and the high-skilled are those with a college degree and above. What you see is that low-skilled migrants had a negative impact on provision of public goods, while high-skilled migrants had a positive impact on provision of public goods. So basically, when low-skilled migrants arrived to account in the United States, what we estimate is that there was a decrease in the basket of public goods provided by local governments, and vice versa when high-skilled migrants arrived. And what is the mechanism through which these effects work? They work through revenues. So low-skilled and high-skilled migrants have opposite effects on the tax base, and so on tax revenues. And in the United States, there is a balanced budget constraint. So what that means is that at the local level, this is at the local level, governments need to break even. If revenues go down, public expenditures need to go down. If revenues go up, public expenditures can go up. So that's what drives these results. Now, going back to the main result, on average, we find that the net effect is close to zero. So what that means is that on average, the low-skilled migrants' negative effect is more or less compensated by the high-skilled migrants' positive effect. But when you look at specific counties do not necessarily receive the same number of migrants as the United States as a whole, as the average. So there is a lot of variation in terms of how many low-skilled and high-skilled migrants specific counties receive. And so what we find is that there is a lot of heterogeneity across US counties in terms of the fiscal effects. There are some counties that experience an increase in provision of public goods. And there are some other counties that experience a decrease in provision of public goods. Okay. So basically, there are winners and losers across counties in the United States. What that means is that on average, the size of the pie, if the size of the pie is the provision of public goods, on average, the size of the pie doesn't change, but the slices change. And transfers carried out by other levels of government, like intergovernmental transfers, in part redistribute these effects from the winners to the losers, but not enough. So that's why there is this heterogeneity across counties in the United States. So basically, the net effect is zero. There is heterogeneity across skill levels. There is heterogeneity across counties, and there is also heterogeneity across generations. There are two types of migrants. So the migrants, the true migrants, true in quotation marks, are the foreign born. In the data, we define migrants as those individuals who were not born in the country where they reside. Now, who are second generation migrants? Second generation migrants are really natives because in the case of the United States, they were born in the United States, so they are American. But their parents were foreign, and so they're called second generation migrants. Well, they have a very positive fiscal impact. So basically, second generation migrants make a very positive contribution to the fiscal balance at the local level in the United States. And this is very important, because basically it gives us a sense about what the long run impact, fiscal impact of migration is. Okay, so now, yes, please. Yes.
Regarding the second generation, how do you deal with the survivorship? Because if you're a first generation immigrant, and you decide that it's not working.
Yeah, you move away.
Whereas the ones who do remain are the ones who are successful.
Yeah.
First generation immigrants, and their children.
Yeah.
Would have a higher chance of.
No, you're right. So these effects, the effects in general of migrants in a given destination country, are basically conditional for the type of migrants that a given country receives. So even if you look at the labor market literature, in the labor market literature, the estimated labor market impact of migration is not for any population of migrants, but it is for the specific population of migrants that that country receives. And that's true also for these fiscal effects. But you're right that the pool of migrants is very likely to be a very select group of people. And that's why probably where this positive effect comes from. Because for the first generation, you have the selection of driven individuals who are risk takers, but at the same time, they also find a lot of challenges when they move. It is difficult to adapt. For the second generation, there are fewer challenges because they grew up in that country, but at the same time, there is still the positive effect of the selection.
I guess that means maybe the comparison would be between second generation children of immigrants and migrants.
Well, people have done that. So there is a very interesting new book by Leah Bustan and Rana Bramiski. Rana Bramiski at Stanford and Leah Bustan at Princeton. And what they do is to look at the cultural and economic integration of first and second generation migrants vis-a-vis Americans. And what they find is that actually second generation migrants move up the social ladder faster than Americans.
But I was thinking in terms of particularly
Well,
similar characteristics.
yes, you know, it would be very nice to do that. And actually, we always were tempted to do that. So to compare what the fiscal impact of first generation migrants who are low skilled and high skilled is compared to low skilled and high skilled Americans. From an econometric point of view, it's much harder to find exogenous variation in the share of low skilled and high skilled Americans. But from a theoretical point of view, you would expect to find very similar effects. So sometimes people ask me about these effects and they ask me, is this about migrants? Well, this is for the most part about the skill that they have. So I would expect that these type of effects are there when a group of low-skilled Americans arrive to a county, or when a group of high-skilled Americans arrive to a county. And then when I explain the theoretical mechanism, you will see why. But those are very good points. They are, I think, the next step in this type of research, comparing what these fiscal effects are for migrants versus natives, and both for the first versus second generation. And it's also related to a lot of very interesting political economy literature. Yes.
I just have a question in terms of the research. Does the research make a differentiation between undocumented immigrants versus documented immigrants?
It doesn't. So we use census data, and census data is believed to include information about undocumented migrants. So the US Census makes a big effort to try to capture information about all households. But then we cannot break down the total number of migrants that we have between documented and undocumented. They're likely to be part of the low-skilled group. So there, you know, for undocumented migrants, in the narrative in the news, there is this idea that they would be more likely to be to have negative impacts. But that's not necessarily true. There is also a lot of anecdotal evidence that undocumented migrants, for example, pay taxes because they have fake social security cards, but at the same time they don't receive benefits. So I would say ex ante, it's not clear how the effects would go. They're likely to be captured in this group of migrants because they're more likely to be low skilled, but then it would be nice to be able to differentiate. Okay, so moving on, let me now spend a few minutes motivating why these fiscal effects are very important. So first of all, when you think about each of us who's a voter and who's thinking about the arrival of migrants and deciding whether it's a good thing or a bad thing, well, we are going to think from an economic point of view about what the impact of immigrants are on our income. But what's relevant is not gross income, it's net income. So net income is income net of taxes. And also what's relevant for our utility from an economic point of view is not only net income, but also the possibility of accessing public goods and services. So basically, provision of public goods and tax rates is what we are talking about in this paper. It's the fiscal effects that we are trying to estimate in this paper. So what I'm saying is that when people think about how they feel about migration, they're definitely going to think about the impact of migration on tax rates, provision of public goods. And if you look at public opinion data, you find evidence of that. So there is a big literature by now on attitudes towards migrants. And I've worked on this literature a long time ago, 20 years ago. And what this literature finds is that voters worry a lot about fiscal effects of migration. So there is evidence that, for example, voters worry that when low-skilled migrants arrive, they may have to pay higher tax rates. Or there is evidence that people worry that schools might become crowded or hospitals might become crowded when migrants arrive. And this is work by Chris Dassman, by myself, Gordon Hanson, Matthew Slaughter. So there is a series of papers about that. And what's important is that what you see in the public opinion data is that, if anything, voters seem to worry much more about fiscal effects than about labor market effects. And I think the intuition there is that chances are that a lot of us are not competing directly with migrants in the labor market. Because, you know, a lot of times natives are not likely to be in the same occupations as migrants. So there is not direct competition. There is a lot of competition between migrants who arrived now and migrants who arrived before in earlier waves. That's where the labor market competition is. But from a fiscal point of view, if there is indeed an impact of migration on tax rates and provision of public goods, then everybody's affected. So you see that the effects through the fiscal sphere are likely to be much more diffused than the labor market effects. Okay, now another reason why these fiscal effects are important is that there is evidence in the literature that immigration has impacted election outcomes. So there are some papers for Europe, and I have worked on the political impact of migration in the United States. And in that paper, which is joint work with Giovanni Peri and Walter Steingras, what we find is that the arrival of low-skilled migrants has a pro-Republican Party impact in the United States, while the arrival of high-skilled migrants has a pro-Democratic Party impact. So what is going on in these effects? Basically, in that paper, we capture the indirect effect the migrants have on the way American voters vote. So when low-skilled migrants arrive, they basically make American voters more conservative. And when high-skilled migrants arrive, they make American voters more liberal. So basically, the bottom line of that paper is that low-skilled migration is negatively perceived on average by American voters. And so when low-skilled migrants arrive, American voters move towards the party that is not as much pro-migration. And when high-skilled migrants arrive, they are more positively perceived by voters in the US, and so they move towards the party which is more pro-migration. Well, what we find is that these effects are much, much more pronounced when the welfare state, so when the amount of public expenditures at the local level is large. So basically, these political effects of migration in part works through these fiscal issues, through these fiscal concerns that people have. Finally, another reason why we think looking at fiscal effects is really important is because of what has happened since right after World War II. So in the big picture of globalization, of the world economic system, since right after World War II, governments have decided that being close, being protectionist was not going to work from an economic point of view. So a lot of governments, like European governments, the United States, a lot of governments have opened up their markets internationally. But they have also realized that there were a lot of voters that didn't like that because they were not on the winning side, they were on the losing side. Because, you know, globalization on average is good, but it creates winners and losers. And so what a lot of governments did to win public support for globalization was to increase the size of the welfare state. So they created a safety net to be able to help those who lost from globalization. And political scientists call this the embedded liberalism theory. Well, this type of mechanism can work and has worked quite well with trade and capital flows. But with migration, it may break down because migration is likely to have a direct impact on the welfare state. So migration, and we do find that, we find that migration has a more negative impact than on revenues. On expenditures, I told you net, the effect is zero, but it is an effect which is more negative compared to the impact of trade, for example. And so to the extent that the welfare state is affected, governments cannot use this policy tool to win the support of public opinion. So from a political economy point of view, these effects are really important. Okay, so now, quite briefly, I want to give you the broad picture about the literature on the impact of migration on fiscal effects. There are two types of papers. There is one group of papers that carries out an accounting of these fiscal effects of migrants relative to natives. So what they do, like accountants, is to try to figure out how different types of migrants and natives pay taxes, what tax rates they pay, what services they use, and they do an accounting exercise. And that's what the National Academy of Science report does. But as you can imagine, this is a very difficult exercise because you have to keep track of a lot of details. So different socioeconomic groups among migrants and natives, different hypotheses. So the bottom line is that the results will be very sensitive to the hypothesis you make. Let me give you an example. One big issue in this National Academy of Science report was what hypothesis to make about public defense at the federal government level. So when migrants arrive, do we think that that will have a positive or a zero impact on the amount of money that the US should spend overall on public defense? Well, you know, public defense is a pure public good. So from that point of view, you would think, well, it doesn't matter whether there are a million more people. If there are a million more people, you shouldn't necessarily spend more on public defense. But there were others who were saying, no, well, if there are more people, maybe a little bit more you should spend, even on public defense. But depending on what hypothesis you make, you get very different results. So in that report, what they do is to have a bunch of scenarios. And according to the scenario, there are very different estimated effects. Some are very negative, some are very positive. And the problem with that is that then you choose your favorite scenario. So there is a lot of, you choose the scenario that you like the best. And you can see that from a policy point of view, that's not great. So that's one group of papers. Then there is another group of papers that uses macro models. So they're very nice, complicated macro models that are calibrated. And those are very nice exercises. There, the issue is that I think they're complementary approach, but the difference compared to what we do is that in these macro models, you cannot capture all the channels through which migration is going to have an impact. So it's difficult to, in particular, capture in these macro models all the different indirect effects of migration, which instead, with our reduced form approach, we can. Because, you know, in a reduced form approach, when you estimate a model with the data, with regressions, the downside is that you don't really know what goes into all this massive amount of data. So you don't necessarily can distinguish between different mechanisms because you have a net effect. But the good thing is that you capture everything, both direct and indirect effects. In a model, you need to include in the model all these different effects for them to be there. So I think a reduced form framework like we use is a complementary approach to an accounting type of exercise and macro modeling. And the surprising thing is that if you look at the literature, there was no paper in the academic literature that estimated the reduced form causal impact of migration from a fiscal point of view. So we were surprised because we were interested in this topic. We started looking at the literature and we couldn't find anything. And then you start wondering, why didn't anybody think about writing about this or estimating these regressions? And then we realized that one potential explanation is that when people think about fiscal effects, when people think about the welfare state, usually people think about centralized welfare states. So in a lot of countries, for example, Italy, the welfare state is very centralized. Most decisions take place at the level of the central government. But there is not a lot of autonomy at the level of local governments. In the United States, that's different. In the United States, local governments have a lot of autonomy. And so basically, from a practical point of view, that means that we have a lot of variation in the data. And that's the variation that we can exploit to estimate a regression model. So that's probably why people were not estimating these models, because in a lot of countries you don't have much variation, because all you have is variation at the country level. Let me tell you a little bit about the local level in the United States. As I told you, the local level is up to the county level. County level governments account for almost a quarter of total public expenditures in the United States. And county level governments raise most of their revenues from their own taxes. So they receive transfers, but transfers are less than 50%, less than half of their own revenues. Most of their taxes are property taxes and sales taxes, not as much in terms of income taxes. And the fact that local governments in the United States can raise these own revenues a lot means that they can also decide how to spend this money. And they do. So local governments have a lot of autonomy, and they decide on very important items of expenditures. First and foremost, education, from kindergarten to 12th grade, K-12 education, but also public housing, public transportation, parks and recreation, local police. So very important expenditures. And so that's the variation that we use in the data. Okay, now, how much more time do I have? Feel definitely free to ask me questions throughout. Now I'm going to give you an intuition about the theoretical framework behind this paper. So here, the idea is the following. The first point that we want to make in the theory is that for these fiscal effects to work, so you know, we find that low-skilled migrants have a negative impact and high-skilled migrants have a positive impact. There doesn't need to be a labor market effect. So these negative and positive effects of low-skilled and high-skilled migrants from a fiscal point of view are totally independent of whether migrants decrease wages. They don't have anything to do with that. What are they driven by? They're driven by compositional effects. So the idea is that when low-skilled migrants arrive, you add a group of people who are poorer than the average, because low-skilled individuals are likely to make less money than the average person who is in the county. Okay? So if you add a group of people who are poorer than the average income goes down. It's simply a compositional effect. So if a bunch of people comes into this room and they have zero income, if we calculate average income before the people come into this room and after the people come into this room, the average income afterwards is lower. It's simply a compositional effect. So average income goes down when low-skilled migrants arrive, but average income is the tax base for income tax revenues. So is the base on which tax rates are applied. And so if the tax base goes down, per capita tax revenues go down. And given the budget constraint, if per capita tax revenues go down, per capita public expenditures go down.
Before you think about public goods, how are you talking about per capita tax? Just public goods that you have to go down to public.
Well, we are talking, so this is a good point. Public goods can be public goods. So they can be the economically defined public goods, but they are also public goods that are not non-excludable and non-rival, because there are some goods provided by the public that are rival. Like if a teacher is teaching one class of kids, it cannot be teaching another class of kids at the same time. So we measure public goods in per capita terms. All that we are, all these effects that I'm explaining are in per capita terms. Because, you know, at the local government level, a lot of the goods that are provided are not pure public goods. Think about public housing. If you give a public house to a person, you don't give it to another person. Parks are public goods, but schools, they're in between, but a lot of services provided by, so that's, we're thinking of goods provided by the government, which are not necessarily public goods in economic terms.
Care about density from a rental perspective. So if you get public good, it goes to the first understand. Now, if one per capita benefits, depends on the.
Well, for us, per capita benefits are equal to per capita public expenditures.
The public good, I understand. If you have more public good, you have tax.
Yeah.
Now, if you have more per capita benefits, like here from life from a economic perspective, is the message that you need to see whether the migration policy.
But how do you define per capita benefits? Yeah, we define it, so for us, the per capita benefit is equal to per capita public expenditure. So they are the same thing.
Why this is the method to judge if our political economy is affecting migration to the effect? When you said about public,
Well, yeah, well, because then at the end, the per capita public expenditure, so the per capita provision of public goods enters our individual utility. Well, that we cannot look at in the data. Yeah, that we cannot look at in the data. We cannot look at the distribution of benefits across individuals. We can only pin down the per capita public expenditure. So I see what your point is. So you were trying to hint at the differences across the population.
Before I don't know because we talked about public, then I decided not to put them on public schools, and then I decided out there.
Well, so that is actually in this political economy literature, it is quite common because the data that you have cannot distinguish. But in the National Academy of Science report, for example, that's a good aspect of that report. They can figure out expenditures targeted at immigrants and expenditures targeted at natives. And was there another question?
It was something similar, a similar question to but I think you can help with the government probably going to probably what is behind the story.
Yes.
If there's public good, that's why it's constrained. It's not. If a lot of public expenditure is pure public good, then there's less public income.
Yes, no, you're right. So here, basically, you see each good is given in per capita term, because we are thinking about goods that are provided also with a fee a lot of times at the local level. Yes. No, you're right. You're right. So one thing that we thought about is eventually trying to at least differentiate in the items of expenditures between pure public goods and not pure public goods. And for the pure ones, not look at the per capita, but look at the total amount of public expenditure. That's a little bit harder, but I think we should try to get at that. Now, moving on, the data that we use is data between 1990 and 2010, every 10 years. So we have 1990, 2000, 2010 for immigration and all the control variables. And we have fiscal variables in all the years ending in 1992, 2002, and 2012. Okay, so some summary statistics. The point of these summary statistics is the first important point, property tax revenues are very important at the local level, more than 40%. And education expenditure is the most important item of expenditure at the local level, more than half, at least in 1990. Next, what about the share of migration? The share of adult migrants in the population went up, but the numbers, the shares are not very high in the United States. So between 1990 and 2010, it went up from 6% to 11%. So by 5 percentage points. They're not very high shares. So for example, if you compare the share of migrants in the US to Qatar, in Qatar, we're talking about more than 80–90% in the Gulf countries. And low-skilled migrants grew in share more than high-skilled migrants. The share of low-skilled migrants went up by 3 percentage points, the share of high-skilled migrants by 1.8 percentage points. Let me show you a map of the United States. So this is the change in the share of low-skilled migrants between 1990 and 2010. The blues are decreases, and the reds are increases. So basically, in the northern counties of the United States, but also in the Rust Belt, there was a decrease in the share of low-skilled migrants. Because basically, the country of origin groups of migrants who used to go to those locations started to come less to the United States. So, for example, many European migrants who used to go to those locations of the United States over time died and didn't come as much. While the share of low-skilled migrants grew a lot in the south and in the coast, most notably close to Mexico, because a lot of Mexican and Central American migrants arrived. Yes, please. So in our measure of migrants, we'll only look at adult migrants because it is adult migrants who pay taxes. But in our measure of expenditures, so in the denominators of all our variables, kids are included. Because, for example, the per capita expenditure on education, when we calculate per capita, so we divide by population, we divide by the total population that includes both American kids and immigrant kids. Because of course, they matter from an expenditure point of view, but they cannot contribute in terms of paying taxes. So here, they would be included in the denominator, but not in the numerator. What about high-skilled migrants? They increase much less. They increased in urban areas. And, you know, the yellow is a slight increase. And there were also areas where the share of high-skilled migrants decreased. But for the most part, high-skilled migrants increased in urban centers. Okay, so I'm gonna jump right into the IB results. So the estimates that control for indigeneity, for the fact that migrants self-select into localities. So these estimates that I'm going to talk about are, we think, causal estimates. So what do we find? First of all, the difference between... Yes, I actually have it in the appendix, but basically what is commonly used in the migration literature is the so-called card instrument. Card having won the Nobel Prize in economics, so now of popular fame. What did he do I think the very first paper was in 1991. He had this idea that migrants go to a given location for two different reasons. The first reason is economics. Migrants are smart. They want to go where the labor market works well. They don't want to go where wages are low. The second reason why they go to a location is because they may have family and friends in that location. So the first reason is the problematic one because it creates endogeneity. You don't want to use that variation. But the variation in the location of migrants driven by family and friends is the exogenous variation that is used in the instrument. And so it's a shift share, which, by the way, now has received a lot of attention, a lot of criticism. So we need to do millions of robustness checks to show the robustness of these estimates, and they're quite robust. So our preferred estimates are in columns 2 and 4, because in columns 2 and 4, we include the commuting zone controls. And these commuting zone controls are exogenous. They are interactions of linear trends with the beginning of the period control variables. Anyways, this is a technicality, but basically, what do these estimates tell us? They tell us that on average, the impact of the overall share of migration is not significant. So there is no star here. When you see an estimate and there are no stars, it's difficult to say what is going on. Because with no stars, it could be that the effect is 0, or it could be that the effect is simply not precisely estimated. So you cannot say much. Let's look at column 4, where we estimate the impact of low and high skilled migrants separately. We do find that the impact of low skilled migrants is negative and highly significant. And we also find that the impact of high skilled migrants is positive and highly significant. So let me give you a sense of the magnitudes. 1 percentage point increase in the share of low skilled migrants increases per capita public expenditures by 2.8% on a yearly basis. A 1 percentage point increase in the share of high skilled migrants increases per capita revenues by 3.3%. These are the revenues results. The next ones are per capita expenditures. Now, what you can do is to combine these two and get a net effect of the overall share of migration. And that's what we do in the paper. I'm gonna do that for public expenditures, which is provision of public goods. So for the next table. For the next table, what I'm gonna do is to tell you what this coefficient implies by itself, what this coefficient implies by itself, and then I'm gonna combine them to tell you what the arrival of all immigrants implied in terms of per capita public expenditures. And I'm gonna do that accounting for all the migrants who arrived between 1990 and 2010. So all the low-skilled migrants who arrived between 1990 and 2010 decreased yearly per capita expenditures by 5.6%. All the high-skilled migrants who arrived between 1990 and 2010 increased yearly per capita expenditures by 5.3%. Now, these estimates are precisely estimated. They are significant. So we can combine them and we can say that all migrants who arrived in that period, both low-skilled and high-skilled, had an impact on per capita public expenditures by 0.3%. So you just take the difference between these two. We don't want to use this coefficient because, again, this is an insignificant estimate. So when you have these not precisely estimated coefficients, you don't really know what is going on. But we can use the other ones and give the magnitude of the effect. So basically, this is a very important result from a policy point of view, because it basically says to all those who worry about these fiscal effects that on net, the effect is very close to 0 from a fiscal point of view at the local level. Now, though, this is on net. So what I mean is that if you consider the United States as a whole, and you combine the effect of low-skilled and high-skilled, on net, what you get is that yearly per capita expenditures decrease by 0.3%. But then we saw that there is a ton of variation across locations in the United States. So some counties lost, some counties gained. Let me show you how much variation there is in the United States in terms of effects at the county level. So the reds are where per capita revenues increase. The blues where they decrease. And this is the map for revenues. And the map for expenditures is this one. So the reds is where per capita public expenditures increased, and the blues is where per capita public expenditures decreased. Okay, if you put them all together, the net effect is very small, 0.3%. But then if you are the part of the board of county commissioners of this county, which is totally blue, you're not going to be very happy. So let me give you an example in practice. We pick two counties which are at the extremes. So Presidio County, Texas, very close to the border, experienced an increase in the share of low-skilled migrants by 10 percentage points, and of high-skilled migrants by only 1 percentage point. On the other hand, Monterey County in California mostly experienced an increase in the share of high-skilled migrants by 7 percentage points, but also a little bit by low-skilled migrants. Well, what we calculate is that in Presidio County, there was a reduction in the provision of local per capita public expenditures of 15%. While in Monterey, California, there was an increase in per capita public expenditures by 14%. So the effects are very different across different locations in the United States. And this is a result that came out also in the National Academy of Science report. So that there is a lot of heterogeneity across locations in the United States.
How much of these results, because this is the migrants and the revenue goes up and down. On the other, I can change the tax rate, and maybe I want to provide less public goods, less food, because people who keep the migrants don't have. So how much, what is the government?
That's a very good question. And it's actually part of the theoretical framework. For the most part, we can tell you mostly about the per capita public expenditure part, but we have some evidence about effective property tax rates, and the evidence is here. So there is adjustment in both dimensions. So what you see is that in locations where low-skilled migrants went, there was an increase in the property tax rate. While in locations, and this is significant, locations where high-skilled migrants went, there was a decrease, but it's not significantly, precisely estimated. So there is adjustment both in terms of benefits and in terms of tax rates. For the US, unfortunately, it's hard to find tax rates. I'm working on Italy, and in Italy, we have data on ICI, IMU, Tari, TASI. So now I know everything about all these tax rates. Okay, let me wrap up because we are close to finishing. So the one result that I wanted to show you, so first I'm going to introduce you with this graph. So this picture breaks down how much first generation immigrants, second generation immigrants, and Americans paying taxes, and how much these three groups get in benefits. So the solid lines are for first generation. They don't pay as much as the other groups in taxes, but they don't receive benefits as much. That's the solid line. Yes. Then the second generation, interestingly, pays the most in taxes. It's the dotted line, and it doesn't use services that much. And finally, the third plus generation is Americans. Americans are in between. They pay in between the first and second generation, and they use quite a lot of benefits. So the National Academy of Science report with the accounting methodology finds the second generation migrants have a positive fiscal impact. We do find the same. We find that there is a very positive in terms of revenues, but also with the controls in terms of expenditures impact of second generation migrants. But importantly, when we control for second generation migrants, it is still true that first generation migrants have on net close to zero impact. So that's all I wanted to tell you. Sorry if it took longer, but we had a very nice discussion in between. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Anna Maria. I think we've already started the discussion, and thanks for that very interesting review, including of the literature of a very important topic, and that many of us aren't that familiar with. So that was very clear and interesting. So why don't we open it up for questions?
Yes.
Yeah, and as a non-economist interested mostly in Europe, I'm wondering to what extent your conclusions are transferable. I mean, in Europe, obviously, migration is an extremely controversial subject, and there are political scientists who have written trying to counteract to some extent some of the populist arguments, and have tried to demonstrate more politically than in such a systematic way as you are doing, that there is not a downward pressure on incomes, that there is not crowding out in terms of public services, and so on and so forth. But could Europeans take any comfort from your study? Or is the methodology so precise and the data set so precise that your conclusions can't really be transferred to other contexts?
So thank you, very nice point, very important point. What can we make of external validity of these results? I can tell you a little bit about what we are finding for Italy. Italy receives migrants who are actually in the data more skilled than Italians, if you look at the level of education. But they are more likely to be employed in blue-collar occupations. So their incomes are lower than Italians on average. So consistent with what we find in this paper, through the addizionale effect, which is the income tax revenue part, we find that when immigrants arrive to a comune in Italy, there is a decrease in per capita income tax revenues, so the addizionale effect. Interestingly, we find that through these compositional effects that I talked about, average income goes down, but also the addizionale effect tax rates go down. So basically, that's a political. It's not like in the US. You see, in the US case, the property tax rate goes up, but in Italy, it seems like locations where migrants go, the comune decides to reduce the size of the welfare state in terms of the income tax revenue. There is a political economy literature in economics by Alessina, who passed away recently, Liana La Ferrara, and also some French economists, Mathilde Munoz, and so on. They say that when migrants arrive, from a political economy point of view, you would expect a reduction in preferences. And that's what we find for Italy for the income tax revenue. Then for the property tax revenue part, the details, the devil is in the details, because what we find is very, very interesting. So if you are familiar with property taxation in Italy, you know that there are differences between prima casa and seconda. And the people are very strict in terms of what they declare as prima casa and seconda casa. Because since a given year, the tax rate on prima casa decreased to zero, but it's always been lower than the tax rate on seconda casa. But basically what we find is that in locations where migrants go, property tax revenues actually go up. And the reason is that people who used to declare the country house as a seconda casa now rent it, most likely to the immigrants. And from a fiscal point of view, they cannot declare it anymore as second. as first house, prima casa. And so they have to pay a higher tax. So I think the institutional variation is going to be important for this type of study. Basically, I do think that we need to do work also which is country specific, because especially from a fiscal point of view, there are many different rules. That's what studying Italy has taught me. When we saw that property tax revenues were going up, that is totally different from what we find in the US. But another thing is that in Italy, the cadastral value of houses doesn't change. It hasn't changed forever. In the United States, it changes every year. And so what we find is that when low-skilled migrants arrive to a US county, house prices go down, and that affects property tax revenues. Because every year, your house has a different value. Here in Italy, the cadastral values don't change. So I think that we will need to look at specific countries. The general framework of looking at tax base versus tax rates stays, thinking about the political economy side as an important side stays, but the country specificity, if anything, are going to matter even more than for the labor market chart.
For that external validity, would you think of going to a non-OECD country as well? I mean, to see even, levels, tax levels, obviously they're extremely high here in Italy, but also elsewhere in Europe. If you did something like Singapore or one of these other places, might be interesting.
Very interesting, very important. I actually know that there is a World Bank data set with this type of data for middle and low income countries. So it's doable. And of course, there are some locations like think of, for example, Singapore, but now Colombia with the Venezuelan crisis. So there are middle and low income countries that visit a lot of migrants.
More than we do in the OECD.
Yes. Yes.
Thank you. Yeah, I have a question regarding the high skill, low skill distinction. So did you do the distinction yourself, or was it in the data? And does it take into account that some migrants from specific countries don't get their diplomas accredited? Do they still count as high skill labor or as low skills labor? And do you do this by diploma or by job?
So this distinction based on a college degree is quite standard in the labor economics literature, but it definitely has some disadvantages that you point out. So, for example, downgrading. A migrant may have a university degree, but then it may not receive licensing. They may not be able to work according to the level of their education. So that needs to be taken into account. That means that, for example, the positive impact that we estimate is potentially a lower bound, because to the extent that there is downgrading of high-skilled migrants, we are estimating an average between the positive impact and the fact that these migrants are not working at their true level of education. So the short answer is that we follow the literature in terms of the definitions, but definitely one could do more. And there is data because we build the measure up to from the individual level. In the census data, you can see the occupation, the individual number of years of education. So you can construct different measures if you want.
I could mention, by the way, in the meantime, I think it looks like we have a question, Q&A.
Okay.
If anybody online wants to ask a question, please put it in the Q&A box and we'll get to it.
Yes, here. Okay. So why do public expenditures decrease with more low-skilled immigrants and vice versa with more high-skilled immigrants? So it is due to the compositional effects that we talked about. when low-skilled migrants arrive, they decrease the average of income. Maybe this question was asked, when was it asked? But basically, it's the steps that I talked about before. I think a good example that I actually use for when I teach this type of effects to my students back in Washington is, so think about your GPA. And say that you have a GPA of 3.5. And then you do one exam. And in that exam, you get 3.4. If your GPA was 3.5 and now you get 3.4, what's going to happen to your average? Your average is going to go down. And that's a compositional effect. So if the last grade that you get is lower than the average, your average is going to go down. So if a group of people who have average less, who have income less than the average comes in, the average income is going to go down. So the reason why low-skilled migrants decrease the average income is not that they decrease wages. It is because you're simply adding to the pool a group of individuals who are poorer than average. And so mechanically, when you recalculate the average is lower. And the same, but in the opposite, with the opposite sign with high-skilled migrants. But that's true not only of migrants, that is going to be true also of Americans. So if a group of very poor Americans go to a location, they're going to decrease the average income. And so I expect that we would find that the fiscal effects are going to be negative. If a group of very rich Americans go to a location, they're going to increase average income. It's not about the migrant status, it's about the skill. So there are two questions.
Well, first, thank you for the presentation. I would say, though, that I thought you were Hispanic because your name is very,
Yes.
I'm like, is she Puerto Rican? I just have like one question, not related exactly to the fiscal part, or I guess it is, but assuming that like politicians only take in consideration the economic part of like granting citizenship to those immigrants who are undocumented in the US, wouldn't it be beneficial for the country economy to grant citizenship and valid social security numbers to those who work? Well, not even with like fake social security cards because they pay taxes, but you know, we have like this huge market of people who get paid under the table, like with cash or things like that. Wouldn't be like a good decision to grant them citizenship, so in the end, the government can collect more taxes from them?
Well, definitely from that point of view. So you're right that migrants who don't have documents are more likely to work in informal occupations. When they work in occupations that are formal, they have to have these fake social security cards, and they need to pay social security contributions, taxes. But if they work in the informal market, they're not going to pay taxes. So if you grant them citizenship, or if you grant them the right to work in the formal market with a social security card, then definitely revenues are going to go up. And, you know, there have been studies that document other positive effects of citizenship, also in terms of self-esteem, the integration in the labor market, the returns to education. So that's only one of the different effects of granting citizenship. There was another question here.
Thanks very much. I'm curious whether politics also play a part in this empirical study. For example, I think you mentioned that for the counties that have more high-skilled migrants, they tend to probably go with the Democrats to be kind of like more pro the migrants, while vice versa for the Republican.
Yes.
So, well, as probably Democrats tend to have a bigger budget in terms of the fiscal policy. So I wonder if you already have a high skill, you have a Democrat, then you have a bigger budget. So I'm actually wondering empirically whether the whole party system actually works in this whole fiscal impact.
Well, no, you're right. So there are many interactions between the political side and the fiscal side. In that paper, you know, all that we can observe is the final voting outcome. The way we interpret that result is by saying that the Democrats are the pro-migration party and the Republicans are less pro-migration, the anti-migration party. But the Democrats are also the pro-large government party and the Republicans vice versa. So there are different interpretations of that. When high-skilled migrants arrive, people may feel more comfortable to vote for the Democrats, knowing that they are the large government party, because they know that the benefits of the large government are going to go to Americans and not to the migrants because they are high skilled. So there are different interpretations, but you're right that also that aspect of the parties is very important. Yes.
I'm very sympathetic with all what you've done in your presentation, but there is one question. If I was reading as a politician result, you say that the net effect of migration is of second order vis-a-vis finance. But if I were a twisted politician, not much twisted, I would say, look, what I want to do is a Australia kind of migration policy, only high skilled. So the question is that I like your spin that you give of summing the two, but if you're a local politician, I would not sum the two, because when I have to decide the people that I want, I have a choice. I might have a choice.
From a fiscal point of view, it is true, but from a labor market point of view, we do need low-skilled migrants.
But the question is that the sum is almost sending too much a pro-migration message when the fiscal side actually gives a sort of different perspective of the effect of those.
Well, the way I would frame it is we really, from an economic point of view, we're talking about, we need both types of migrants. Low skilled for some reasons, high skilled for other reasons. From a fiscal point of view, if you can get the proportion of the two right, you don't have cost on net. Because basically what our paper is saying is that if you have enough of both, if you're not too specialized in low-skilled migrants, but if you let in both low-skilled and high-skilled, the high-skilled from a fiscal point of view are gonna compensate the negative effect of the low-skilled, but you're gonna get the benefits from a labor market point of view of both low-skilled and high-skilled. So that's, but we talked a lot about how to sell the results because they are very sensitive politically.
Well, I mean, I think an issue too, I think that's problematic. These are really interesting results and show a great deal of, even rationality in explaining it. But frankly, it seems to me that all I need is a good anecdote that I can tweet that shows an immigrant who's taking advantage of public services is not paying taxes to be my war cry. And we see this very frequently. We see it here with Giorgia Meloni, we see it with Donald Trump, we see a lot. That seems to be more emotional than it is analytical. So I think the analytical thing is very convincing, but the emotional thing is, I think, the issue when we talk about immigration.
No, you're right. The media is definitely very important for how people vote, but at least in terms of policymakers' decisions, to know how things stand is really important.
Yeah, sure.
But for the way people vote, I agree that there is going to be a whole no rational side in the sense that people are going to be affected not just by information, for example, academic results, but also
or just like this, like DeSantis sending, 55 immigrants up to Cape Cod or whatever. It's the same. It's a point. Doesn't matter anything about the analytics behind it. It's just he's trying to sort of
although
play to people's emotions.
I just went to a Brookings event about these fiscal effects, and in a way, what DeSantis did is I don't like
It's
this.
consistent with it,
It's
yeah.
consistent
Yeah, that's
with
right.
what we find in the sense that from a fiscal point of
Take the
view,
low- low rate.
yeah, there are uneven effects.
Yeah.
And you know, these uneven effects do play in the political arena. So I guess one message of this paper is we also need to think about how these effects are distributed within a country, in the sense that we know on average immigration is very good, but then we need to carry out the redistribution of the gains within. Think, for example, areas like in the United States, even Washington. Now, migrants are moving out of the district to the counties around the district, and there are lots of high-skilled migrants in the district. But then the counties where all the low-skilled migrants go are going to have bigger fiscal costs. Washington, D.C. is going to benefit from all the high-skilled migration that is taking place, and there needs to be some redistribution to make things work. Well, in part there is. So we have data on transfers. I didn't show you the regressions, but okay. But we do show, and we do find that, okay, here, when low-skilled migrants arrive, the federal government transfers more money, and that's highly significant. When high-skilled migrants arrive, there's a reduction, but it's not precisely estimated. And in particular, but I don't have it in our regression table, what we find is that the federal government transfers that increase are for education. So actually, when you look at the expenditure side, and that's really important, we find that neither low-skilled nor high-skilled have an impact on educational per capita expenditure. So basically, in terms of education expenditure, the redistribution that takes place is enough. So, and that's really important, not in terms of other expenditure items. So for public welfare, which includes public housing, there is not enough redistribution. But for education, because for education, a lot of time, so we know there are formulas that depend on the number of pupils. And so transfers are going to react automatically to an increase in the population that is driven by migration. So for education specifically, it seems like these formulas do their job. But for other expenditure items, that's not the case. Yes, please.
So I want to continue this question about what exactly the policy implications are, and your findings and the data at the county level, but the counties or county executives have very limited impact on structuring the labor market and zero impact on immigration policies or redistribution policies from the federal government. So what am I missing here on the on the policy impact? Where exactly is it on different, when those things operate at different levels?
So you're saying there is definitely, in terms of formal migration policy, going to be an impact on what migration policy is, because you're right. Migration policy in the United States is at the federal level. Although, for example, in terms of enforcement, there is variation at the county level. For enforcement, for example, of regulations on undocumented migrants, there is a lot of variation at the county level. But you're right, in general, the results of this paper don't speak to migration policy, because migration policy by definition is not decided at the county level, it's decided at the federal level. But the federal government should take these results into account, because they show us that if not taken into account, they could matter from a political point of view. The way people vote is going to depend a lot on what happens on in their specific locations, in their specific county. So basically, the results of this paper tells us that policymakers and politicians run a big risk not to address, for example, the unevenness of fiscal effects at the county level. But there are not going to be implications in terms of, so of course, the commissioner of the Board of Commissioners at the county level is not going to be able to change federal migration policy. That's true. There are rules that they can change at the local level in terms of public finance that they can do.
Good. All right. Well, I'm afraid we're out of time. And I think that the very vivacious discussion is indicative how interesting your talk was. So thanks very much
You're
for giving us
welcome.
this
You're
talk this evening.
welcome.
So, thanks.
Thank you. Prego.
Thank you very much.
You're welcome.
Very interesting.
Thank you.
Let's just dive here.